Well, that's weird. Why do you still hear the audio? Well, that's weird. Why do you still hear the audio? Oh, there's a playback loop. Where's that coming from? Oh, there's a playback loop. Where's that coming from? Oh, there's a playback loop. Where's that coming from? Yeah, well, there's a loop. Hold on. Something's playing. I don't know what. Yeah, well, there's a loop. Hold on. Something's playing. There we go. It was in Twitch. All right, that's better. Main screen back up. All right, Ryan, audio level's better now? I'm talking now to find out if the audio levels are behaving like they're supposed to, or if we're still somehow oddly low. You know, Ryan, I'll bet the volume on the Pearl got turned down because I was doing something last week with it. That is probably why, because the levels do appear to be fine. Greetings, everybody. Howdy, howdy, howdy. We're almost ready here. Good Lord, there's a lot of activity in the chat room. What is going on over here today? Let's see here. Let me get the live control room up here. All kinds of people saying good morning to each other. That is fantastic. Look at that. And Burton says crank it to 11. Perfect. Sounds good to me. All right. Let's see here. I'm going to unplug that because that we no longer need. Oops. We, however, do need to get rid of that black box. Perfect. We are going to be needing. All right. So we're not going to start exactly on time today. Just, you know, that's just the way it is sometimes. Let's get that set up. I haven't used my little plate with the ball head on it in a while. I got to hook that back up. I don't know why. I think I stole parts for something else. Okay. All right, start rolling audio over there, Ryan. Record that thing. Get rid of all this crap. We don't really need all these things here. All right. And we have cameras. We have more stuff than we possibly need for this. Okay. You guys ready? There's a lot of stuff going on in the chat room. That's kind of fun. I think we're ready. It's Monday. You know how Mondays are. Mondays are always this way, aren't they? Mondays are always like, I don't know what's happening here. All right. Quick little bit of this. It's just water. Don't get excited. It's just water. And let's do this thing. All right. Have you ever wondered what i.Resolution, i.Dynamic, and i.ISO mean on your Lumix camera? Well, how about we find out? Good morning and welcome to PhotoJoseph's Photo Moment, the first live 3 times a week show here at youtube.com/PhotoJoseph every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. If you can't watch live, you can watch it some other time, but if you can watch live, then it's super cool and fun because you get to participate in the chat, in the comments like this. Look, this is a live chat. This is a live show. So for those of you watching not live and you're like, why? It's live. It's all live. We are streaming right now to Twitter. We're not streaming to Twitter. We're streaming to YouTube, we're streaming to Facebook, and we're streaming to Twitch. I see there's at least one person watching in Twitch. If Twitch, I will see your questions here. If you're on Facebook, try and jump over to the YouTube stream because it's easier for me to follow the questions there. Anyway, let's get this thing going. So we want to find out what these i.modes are on your Lumix cameras. And there are probably similar modes in other cameras. This information probably applies to many other manufacturers, but I know the Lumix one, so this is where we're going to focus on it. And the biggest question I think right off is, other than the obvious what is it, is should I use it and is it going to make any difference? So we're going to try and answer all of that. We're going to start with the one that has the biggest difference regardless of whether you're shooting RAW or JPEG or frankly what you're shooting, and that is i.ISO. So let's explain first of all how you get into this. When you're looking at your camera and you're adjusting the ISO, and I'm gonna pull up my G9 here. I've got a G9 and the GX85 here. I can't actually plug this one into the switcher, but we'll take a look at it on the G9. And if let's see here, let's pull this up, make sure it's up. Yes, it is. Pull this up here, look in the bottom of the screen. I have my ISO options. So you have ISO auto, and then you have this i.ISO, and then you have your low, and then you know your 200, 400, and so on, so on, so on ISOs. So you may not always see i.ISO. For example, the camera right now is an aperture priority. If I switch this over to manual mode and go back into the ISO, it is no longer there. i.ISO is not there. If I go back into aperture priority or any of these semi-automatic modes, then i.ISO will be there. Okay, so it's there. That's how we turn it on, just like a regular ISO. What does it actually mean, though? So here's the thing. It's an intelligent ISO. It will adjust the ISO dependent on the scene, dependent on what it sees. Specifically, it's looking for motion. If it sees motion, then it is going to opt for a higher ISO so that it can give you a faster shutter speed. Think about it like this. If you're taking a picture of a landscape, nothing's moving, it's a static scene. In general, you want the lowest ISO possible because you want to have the cleanest picture possible, like the lower ISO, less noise. If, however, which means, lower ISO, that means that you will have a longer shutter speed. So on a photograph like a landscape where things are not moving, then you can afford that, right? You can afford to have a longer shutter speed, say a 30th of a second, 60th of a second, whatever it might be, and you don't have to worry about the motion, any kind of motion blur. However, if you start photographing things that are moving, people, cars, bouncing children, whatever, you probably want to freeze that motion. At least that's what the camera is going to assume that you want to do. And therefore, you need a faster shutter speed, which means therefore you need a faster ISO. So I ran a little test this morning just to see how well this actually worked. And it works really well. This is kind of fun. So I'm going to pull up some pictures that I shot in, that I photographed this morning, and we're going to bring them up into Lightroom, if I can figure out what happened to my Lightroom window. That's odd. Don't close the window. Where'd my Lightroom go? There it is. Okay. So, and these are not the pictures. We're going to come back and look at these in a moment. Let me bring up the little searchy dealio. Let's go back to the library in here. Okay, I'm going to, full screen sometimes is more annoying than it's worth in these modes, in these things. Let's go to raw photos, because that's where these are. And we're just going to look at this last one here. So this is me, obviously, sitting very still, right? And if we look at the settings of the camera, you will see over here that it shows a 60th of a second, f5.6, I think it was aperture priority, I think so, at ISO 2000. Okay, so that is a proper exposure for that setup. Me sitting in the chair here, lights as they are, that's proper exposure, nobody's moving. And then I pushed the button again, didn't touch a single setting in the camera except to switch between auto ISO, I'm sorry, scratch that. I didn't change anything on the camera. It was already in auto ISO. Wow, I'm here today. It was in intelligent ISO, i.ISO. We could start the whole show over, it's better. It was in intelligent ISO, so I shot the picture of me just sitting there, and then I went and pushed the button again. And instead of just sitting there, I started jumping up and down like a wild monkey in front of the camera. Right. And for that picture, let's go to the next one. There's me midair. It's brilliant, obviously. Look at the ISO. The ISO jumped up to 4,000, and it shot it at 125th of a second, still at f5.6. So the previous photo, 60th, ISO 2000. Me jumping up and down like an idiot, 1/125th, ISO 4000. So the camera automatically saw the motion and went, oh, it sounds like a good idea to crank up the ISO. So that is what intelligent ISO does, i.ISO or intelligent ISO. If you actually look in the manual and you try and do a search for i.ISO, you might not find it because it's listed in there as intelligent ISO, where the other modes we're going to talk about are listed as i.Resolution and so on. But if you want to find it, read more about it. It'll tell you basically what I just told you, but that is the idea. It will automatically adjust the ISO depending on the content of the scene. Pretty cool. So my recommendation, if you're using automatic ISO, put it in the intelligent ISO. Don't just use straight auto, put it in intelligent auto. That way it will actually read the scene and adjust accordingly. Pretty cool, right? Okay, so that's the first one. The next two are i.Resolution and i.Dynamic. We're going to start with Dynamic because that one is easy to see, and I was able to create some samples of this morning. i.Resolution is a little bit harder to see. I actually couldn't get it to make a visual difference that I could see, but I did find some older references online to it. So we're going to take a look at those. Incidentally, if you are watching live, make sure that you do participate in the chat room. We will be doing a Q&A after the show. We'll bring that up. Again, we've got our live chat happening over here. I see people flying by. We will bring that up at the end and do a Q&A portion of the show, so make sure you get your questions ready for that. Also, I just wanted to throw this up real quick, too, to remind you of our value for value model here on the show. If you feel like you have learned something from today's show, that is kind of the whole idea after all. If you learned something from today's show, and if you took value from today's show, then consider putting value back. Head over to PhotoJoseph.com/support, and you'll find all kinds of lovely ways that you can provide value. Incidentally, one of those ways is the GH5 training if you're a GH5 user. Or if you really want to have some fun, you could join me in India. I am going to India, and I'm taking up to 8 photographers with me. Heck, you don't have to be a full-time photographer. You can just be any person who enjoys taking pictures and wants to go to India. This is going to be early next year, January 30th through February 9th of 2019. But sign up now. It's at photojoseph.com/India. You're going to find all the good information that you need in there. And I would encourage you to please consider coming along. If you have any questions about it, you know how to find out. Hit me up anywhere, and I will do my best to answer them for you. But that's going to be a lot of fun, and I would love to have some of you coming there with me. Okay. i.Resolution and i.Dynamic. So dynamic is the first one. Dynamic as in dynamic range. If you're not familiar with that concept, the idea behind dynamic range is the range of your darkest shadows, your darkest darks, to your brightest brights, your brightest highlights that can be seen at any given time. If you have a very narrow dynamic range, then you don't have very dark shadows to very bright highlights. And that could be based off of the capability of your camera. It could also just be the scene itself. For example, if you are like in here looking at this scene, even though there's a black background and a white background, the dynamic range is not massive in here. That black is not pure black, the white is not pure white, so the dynamic range is fairly compressed. If we go outside into full sun, but we also have something that's in a dark shadow from a building or whatever right next to it, that's a huge dynamic range. Your darkest shadow is really, really dark. Your brightest highlight is really, really bright. So you have this extended, very large dynamic range. The whole idea behind HDR, or high dynamic range photography, is generally that you are taking pictures that are beyond the capability of your camera, blending them together to try and get more dynamic range into a single scene. That's kind of what HDR photography is. The i.Dynamic feature in the cameras, what it is going to do is going to try and get more range into the scene at once. It's basically going to lift the shadows up so that your darkest shadows become visible, pull your highlights down, your brightest highlights, pull them in so they become visible, so that when you're looking at the photo, you go, oh, well, I can see the details in that bright cloud, and I can see the details in that dark shadow all at once. And the camera does this automatically. Now, here's the kicker. It only is going to apply to your JPEGs. This is the kind of thing that gets rendered into the JPEG. It is not into the RAW file. So let's take a look at some samples of what this looks like, because that is something I was able to create this morning. And let's pull this up. Let's see here. I think I need to go back to the JPEG view here. I'll find the right thing here. Oh, that's right. I always forget how this thing works in Lightroom sometimes. I use this thing all the time, and still I'm like, where sometimes? Oh. OK, so we're going to take a look at the JPEGs here. And here is the scene. So this is with i.Dynamic turned off. And let's take a quick look in the menu settings on the camera itself. Let's switch over here real quick and go into the menus. And you'll see under the camera options, you have i.Resolution and i.Dynamic. And we're looking at i.Dynamic. You can go for off. You can go to low, standard, high, or auto. Probably going to generally leave it to auto unless you have a very specific scene that you're doing. But let's just take a look at what we're actually getting out of it. So let's go back to the Mac. And here's the first picture. So this is with it off. And you can see my clouds are a bit blown out. This is the JPEG. Clouds are a bit blown out. Quite dark shadows here. And then I go through and I turn it on low, medium, and high. And then there's auto. And auto, in this case, grabbed the high. So let's just compare high, because that's our best representation, to off in here. And you can see massively in the shadows. Look at how much it's lifted up the shadows in here. Right, looking pretty good. And the highlights, it has definitely pulled it back. It hasn't pulled it back quite far enough to get full detail in the clouds. There are, after all, some pretty bright clouds up there. But it is a massive, massive difference. I mean, that is completely blown out clouds to mostly visible clouds in there. Now, I said that this doesn't apply to the RAW, but as those words are coming out of my mouth, it occurred to me that I didn't actually verify that. So we're going to verify that. Now let's look at the RAW. We'll go to here. There's off, low, medium, high. Well, isn't that interesting? It's like a very, very subtle difference. But there does appear to be a slight difference in there. Huh, very curious. Very curious indeed. Well, there you go. I think that requires more testing. It might actually have a very subtle difference in the RAW as well. That's hard to tell. That could just be the scene changing as the clouds are going by. Certainly not as dynamic as the JPEGs were, but that is that's actually a little bit surprising. So maybe it does make a very slight difference to the RAWs. But it is primarily for the JPEG. So if you're thinking, well, I never shoot JPEG, what's the point? I always recommend, especially if you're playing with the color modes, the color profiles in your camera, that you shoot RAW plus JPEG. So you get both. That way you have that JPEG that's what the camera wanted to create, what the camera created itself. That's what matches what you see on the back of the LCD. And then you also have the RAW. We've talked about that a whole bunch, and it's just something I always do. Always shoot RAW plus JPEG. And in that situation, that's obviously what I did here. You get both. You get that result from the camera, plus you get the RAW file to go back to. Okay, so the third one is i.Resolution. Now this is probably the most confusing one, because you're thinking, well, hold on, is it going to change the actual resolution of my file? I'm shooting, 20 megapixels or whatever it might be. What am I suddenly going to get, a 30 megapixel file or only a 10 megapixel file? No. What it really is, it's essentially sharpening. It's a little bit more advanced than sharpening. And just because we can, we're going to look at what this says in the manual, because you're going to like this. It's a really, let's go back to here. In the manual, this is for the manual for the GH5, but it's going to be the same everywhere. i.Resolution, pictures with sharp profile and resolution can be taken using the intelligent resolution technology. Thank you. We now have intelligent resolution technology. Okay, it is essentially sharpening and maybe a little bit of contrast, edge detection contrast sort type of thing going on. It is going to enhance the apparent resolution of the file, of the photo. That's where the resolution comes from. We've talked about before when doing sharpening, when you're adjusting the sharpening of the image, it is an apparent sharpness, right? It's not like the image is becoming more in focus. The way sharpening works is it looks for edges. Let's just say the edge, like from my shirt to the gray background or the white background there. It finds those edges and it increases the contrast on either side of the edge. So if you think about zooming way into the edge of my arm here, let's do this side against the white, way into the edge of my arm here, you have, actually, let's do it against the gray. That's probably an easier idea. If you were to zoom way into here, and you've got essentially a row of pixels that is the edge of my shirt, and then another row of pixels that is the edge of the background. So the first layer of background versus the last layer of shirt. Does that make sense? And you increase the contrast just around the edge. The perception will be that it's sharper because you have a higher contrast, larger separation between the background and the foreground. It could be hair. If you have a strand of hair against a dark hair against a light background, by increasing the contrast around the edges of that hair, it becomes apparently sharper. Now, we talk about resolution and effective resolution a lot, and the idea behind effective resolution is if you were to sharpen an image, if you were to, how do I explain this better? Let's take a look at, let's talk about this from the sense of the removal of the anti-aliasing filter that has happened across the Lumix line. Well, maybe not across the entire line, but for most of the line now, where you had a camera that, the GX8 was the first one that removed the anti-aliasing filter, and you had a sensor that was a 16 megapixel sensor, I believe that's right. And the 16 megapixel sensors always had the anti-aliasing filter on there. The anti-aliasing filter has the benefit of removing a moire pattern, but it has the drawback of detracting a little bit of sharpness, takes a little bit of sharpness away. When that filter was removed, Panasonic said that the effective resolution of the camera was more like 20 megapixels, meaning if you were to take a 20 megapixel photo with the anti-aliasing filter on, and then you took a 16 megapixel photo with the anti-aliasing filter off, they would appear to the eye to be the same resolution. If you were to zoom one in a little bit more than the other so that they were the same size, same size on screen, that the one without the filter, so it's a sharper image, would appear to be a higher resolution, so an effective resolution. That's effectively what's happening here. It's simply by adding a little bit of sharpening, it has increased the effective resolution, apparent resolution. It's not really affecting the resolution. It just kind of looks that way to the eye. Kind of sort of makes sense. It really is just sharpening. It really is just sharpening. So now the menu has, let's go back into the camera here, you have the options in here of low, standard, and high. And on the Lumix GX85 and some other cameras, there's an extended as well, so it's even higher. It doesn't have an auto, though, and I don't know why the extended isn't in all the cameras. Maybe it was deemed to be too much, but there's low, standard, high, and possibly extended. The funny thing is, and I can't plug this in to show you, but the extended is out of order on the menu. It's like high, standard, low, and then extended. It's a little bit odd. So you would think maybe it's less than low, but it's the highest one. I looked that up to verify it. But it gives you that extra sharpening that, again, is applied to the JPEG. Now, I went out and I shot several photos with both of these cameras trying to see the difference, and I couldn't see the difference. But I did find a very old article that actually dates back to the Lumix GH3 that has samples that show it pretty well. So let's take a look at that now, and then we're going to wrap this thing up and head over to the Q&A. So let's see here, go back to the computer. So this is the sample photo. This website is dcresource.com. I will put a link to this down below for anyone who's curious about reading the full thing. But here is with intelligent resolution off, i.Resolution off. And then as I go through, there's low, standard, high, and then extended. You'll see how the image appears to get just a little bit sharper. The contrast is changing, especially around the edges. Let me go between off, because that's going to be the easiest to see, up to extended. And I'll toggle back and forth between those a few times. And if you look at the detail of the building here, the highlights versus the shadows, the bright spots versus the dark spots, you'll see that slight increase in sharpness, and that is, again, sharpening in software. It's not sharpening from the camera being refocused. So it's an apparent sharpness, it's an apparent resolution shift, just a little bit higher resolution, and that's it. So what is my recommendation? Well, going back to intelligent ISO, I say use intelligent ISO. I think it's brilliant. Leave that on. If you're only ever shooting RAW, then the i.Resolution and i.Dynamic probably don't make any difference. We saw it might have made a subtle difference with the dynamic, but I would just leave them off, because that's the kind of thing that you're going to do in post anyway. But if you're shooting JPEG or shooting RAW plus JPEG, then put them on. Put the dynamic one at auto. I would leave that one at auto. And for the resolution one, I would say standard, and if you feel like your JPEGs are coming out a little bit over-sharpened, a little bit too much, then back it off to low, and maybe you end up turning it off altogether. But give it a try. Give it a try and see if it's something that you like, if you like the results coming out of it. And again, if you're wondering why on earth you would ever want to shoot JPEG, remember that one of the things you can do with these cameras is transmit your file wirelessly from the camera to your smartphone for instant sharing to Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever you like, and that will allow you to have that image, the JPEG that was created in camera, whatever look you dialed into the camera, baked into that JPEG file that you can then share it immediately. And obviously, at any point, you can pull these files into your computer, get the raw file, and start all over again if that's what you want. Or if you don't, if you just look at the JPEG and go, actually, thumbs up to that, I'm good with that. Why mess around with the raw in the first place? If you're happy with the JPEG, just go for it. Okay, that, my friends, is i.Resolution, i.Dynamic, and i.ISO. I hope that was useful to you. If you have any questions about what we just talked about, stick around. We'll do the Q&A coming up next. Good morning and welcome back to PhotoJoseph's Photo Moment. This is the Q&A portion of the show. We just talked about i.Resolution, i.Dynamic, and i.ISO, Intelligent ISO, and what those mean to your camera settings. And we looked at some samples, we looked at some side-by-sides and saw a pretty clear difference in some of them. And now we're in the Q&A. Let's see if you guys have any questions about this or, frankly, anything else. We can talk about whatever you'd like today. And let's see what's going over here in the chat room. So let me pull up the chat. We had a pretty active chat going on today. That's kind of cool. Let's see here. Burns Tech, oh, hello, Burns, says, have you looked into chatbots for automated message on Twitch and YouTube? I have not. I probably should look at that for Twitch. YouTube, I like this interaction here, so I wouldn't want it automated there. And I always have Ryan over there keeping an eye on people, making sure that people are behaving themselves. But no, I haven't tried any chatbots. That might be a good idea over in Twitch. That might be. We'll have to check that out. All right, let's see here. Burns Texas audio is good. Oh, good. Yeah, we're questioning that in the beginning. I guess I'm very, very early on here. In the chat here, Bernardo says, hey, PhotoJoseph, that's me. Does the i.Resolution or the i.Dynamic change the raw file or just the JPEG? So that's what we were talking about. I had said in the beginning it was just the JPEG. Then we looked at the raw files like, well, that is a slight change, but that could have just been a coincidence thing. I'm going to stick with it is really about the JPEG file. And it's definitely where we saw the biggest change. That change that we saw in the raw might have just been coincidence, but it does merit a little bit of further testing, But you're going to have the same raw data regardless, so I don't think it would really matter, but it's worth playing with a little bit more. Let's see, Claudio Schmidt says, on G85, Intelligent ISO is only available in A and P modes, not in Intelligent Auto, S, or anything else. So, okay, so the Intelligent ISO is definitely not going to be available in manual, because in manual mode, you remember the whole point of auto is you got your trifecta of exposure, right? You have your ISO, you have your shutter speed, and you have your aperture. If you're in manual mode, you have determined what your shutter speed and your aperture are. So the ISO is the last thing that can be changed. And if you set the ISO into automatic, there's only one correct ISO, right? It can't possibly change the ISO without then having to change the shutter speed or aperture as well. And because the whole point of the intelligent ISO is that it will adjust the ISO dependent on what's happening in the scene, it then therefore has to be able to change something else to go with it. So in the photo sample that we did of me jumping in the air, when I was sitting still, it chose a slower shutter speed and lower ISO. When I jumped up in the air and it saw movement, it opted to a higher ISO so that it could have a higher shutter speed. It changed two things at once. So if you're in the manual mode, then it is not able to change two things. It can only change one. Therefore, the only one it can change is ISO, so it's just going to be standard ISO, standard auto ISO. It can't be the intelligent ISO. So the option is not even available. It just defaults to standard auto. Now, you said it's not available in shutter priority. That's interesting, and that does make sense. And I hadn't actually looked at that. Let me just take a look on my G9 here real quick. And yep, same thing. So it is not available in shutter priority. So that is telling us that when you're in aperture priority, it can change the shutter speed and the ISO. We already talked about that. If you're in shutter priority, grabbing a different aperture is not going to freeze motion, right? That's just going to make more or less in focus. So it really is about detecting motion, freezing motion, therefore it wants to have that shutter speed control as well. And then it also works in P, full program mode, where it will allow you to do that too. So yeah, so that makes sense. It makes perfect sense. So thanks for pointing that out. I hadn't actually looked it up, but that is totally, totally logical. Bart says, not sure if you mentioned this, but do these modes work in video? Not that I would ever set anything to any form of auto, but just curious. It does actually. If you go, let me see here, if I go to full manual video, so the creative movie mode, and I put it into shutter priority, okay, and I cannot do, okay, I can't do it there. I think I can do it in let's try program mode. So it doesn't do it there. Let's go full auto, so program mode. ISO, nope, doesn't do it there either. Interesting. Okay, so it doesn't apply, which makes sense, except that you wonder if it was going to choose a higher shutter speed or not for the video, but it isn't. It isn't. So okay, so it does not apply to video. Good to know. Good question. I hadn't even thought about looking that up. So very good question. Let's see here. What else we got? Christopher Pepe says this Anto Vega video. What do these do for video? I do not know what Anto Vega video is. So I don't know. Sorry about that. Any other questions? Looks like no other questions coming in here. So if you have any other questions, get them in there really quick, or else we're going to wrap this thing up. And we're going to call it a day on the earlier side today, which would be nice. It was a slightly shorter show here. Nothing else coming in? Nothing else coming in? All right. That's it then. We're going to wrap this thing up. Thanks a bunch for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you learned something. Remember, if you did learn something, consider putting a little bit of value back into the show. Head over to PhotoJoseph.com/support. If you gained value from today's show, consider throwing some value back in. Sorry, I'm trying to read comments that are flying by while I'm talking at the same time. And of course, if you want to join me in India, head to PhotoJoseph.com/India and check that out. That is going to be a really, really fun photography workshop. But do sign up sooner rather than later. Claudio is saying, i.ISO is indeed available in MF and M. MF being manual focus. Not quite sure what you mean. Not quite sure what you mean there. We'll leave it at that. Okay, thanks everybody. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you next time. See you on Wednesday. Bye-bye.